What happens when Prince Charming or someone from the past drops their fake act and starts doing terrible things like it's totally normal? We're talking about cheating, stealing, violence, fraud, child abuse, and even betraying their country. Watch this video all the way through to find out why people really hate Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew was born in a palace where golden walls protected him from getting in trouble. At 65 years old, the fake image built around him has fallen apart. And the man who was once trained to be the monarchy's charming soldier is now its biggest embarrassment. He's basically admitted without saying it directly that the world was right about him all along. The scandals that followed him since he was young weren't made up or people being crazy, they were warnings the palace chose to ignore. Before Prince Andrew ever got on a plane, shook someone's hand, or faced any scandal, he was a kid who thought rules were only for other people. By 65, when the world finally forced his secrets into the light, it became clear he didn't turn cruel. He was raised in cruelty's shadow, allowed to tease, annoy, and control others without getting punished. One of the earliest stories that makes everything disturbing came from Windsor Castle. According to writer Ingrid Seward, when Andrew was about 5 years old, he wandered into the stable yard where guards and workers were doing their jobs quietly. He made fun of the guards on duty, mocking how stiffly they stood. He kicked the dogs. He swung sticks at the horses' legs. When the stable workers asked him to stop, he refused. Finally, 2 workers got fed up with his behavior and physically picked him up and threw him into a pile of horse poop, shoveling more dung on top of him. Yes, it was embarrassing for him, but it was also a lesson about limits and consequences, except nobody followed through. Nobody made this powerful child change his ways, but that was just the start. On another time, young Andrew teased a servant so badly that the servant, breaking all the rules, hit back. He struck Andrew, giving him a black eye. The prince ended up on the floor, shocked and bleeding. His caretaker was outraged. The servant offered to quit, expecting to be punished. The queen said no. She thought Andrew had earned it. The servant kept his job. The child who could get hit but still stay protected learned something dangerous. Your power comes from making others angry. Your privilege comes from surviving their anger. These early incidents weren't just random bad behavior. They were like previews of how Andrew would act when the whole world was watching. The boy who made fun of guards at 5 became the man who demanded curtains be pulled exactly right and stuffed bears arranged perfectly. With staff scared of making tiny mistakes, the child whose face got bruised by a servant became the adult who got bruised by words, press statements, and denials. In the early 1980s, when Princess Diana amazed the world with her beauty and innocence, Andrew was already getting a very different reputation. He was supposed to be the charming youngest son, good-looking in his uniform, the single prince whose love life would excite the public. Instead, he became known inside palace walls as spoiled, arrogant, and shockingly immature. How staff described him as demanding to the point of being cruel, ordering them around with the attitude of a man who thought he was better than everyone, like he had a god complex. Charlotte Briggs, a former maid, told how Andrew once screamed at her for leaving a small gap in his curtains, embarrassing her over a mistake no one else would even notice. This wasn't a one-time thing. It happened all the time. His bedrooms were filled with stuffed animals lined up in exact order. If servants moved a teddy bear or didn't place them exactly according to his detailed map, he would explode in childish anger. To outsiders, it seemed quirky. To those who worked for him, it was abuse. A grown man of 35 having tantrums like a 5-year-old boy, his mother made excuses for him. His father, Prince Philip, called him the spare, a man meant to come second to Charles, but free from the responsibilities that being king required. That freedom fed a darker side of Andrew's personality as he grew up. The public nicknamed him Randy Andy. Unlike his brothers, who were more careful with the press, Andrew loved his playboy reputation. He dated actresses and models, showed off his wealth, and acted like nothing could touch him. When he married Sarah Ferguson in 1986, the fairy tale fell apart quickly. Their marriage was destroyed by scandal, with Ferguson caught in embarrassing situations while Andrew continued his own reckless behavior. They got divorced, but their weird closeness afterward created even more rumors. To the monarchy, Andrew was no longer a reliable representative of the crown. but an unpredictable problem. While Britain suffered from economic problems and budget cuts, Andrew was flying around the world using taxpayers' money. He got the nickname Air Miles Andy for his excessive use of helicopters and private jets, costing the public millions of dollars. Newspapers exposed his spending habits, his expensive vacations, and how he abused his military position for perks. The public got angrier, questioning why this man, who did few meaningful jobs, was wasting money while ordinary families struggled. He ignored the criticism, thinking his title made him untouchable. What no one realized was how far his arrogance would eventually drag him, and the monarchy into the dirt. Inside the palace, rumors got louder. Staff noticed his obsession with status symbols from the number of medals pinned to his uniform. To the women he was seen with in clubs and restaurants, he was desperate to be admired but couldn't earn respect. Friends started calling him gullible, easily manipulated by compliments, and willing to hang out with anyone who made him feel important. This weakness would later become the key to his downfall. By the late 1990s, Andrew's career as a naval officer had ended, leaving him searching for something meaningful to do. He was appointed as a trade representative meant to help British business overseas. Instead, his role became another scandal. Reports came out about his ties to dictators and businessmen with questionable backgrounds. Leaked U.S. government cables described him as arrogant, rude, and dismissive. Embarrassing British officials who worked with him, he had turned the job into a platform for his personal networking, trading on his royal name for access and favors. The prince, who once represented military discipline, now symbolized greed and corruption. The press made fun of him constantly, but Andrew still carried himself with smug confidence. He had one defense: the monarchy's protection. The Queen protected him, covering his debts, smoothing over his scandals, believing her son's dignity was worth preserving. But behind the curtains of Buckingham Palace, the staff had already figured out what the public was only starting to suspect. Andrew wasn't just immature, he was dangerous to the crown's survival. His selfishness had no limits, his behavior was reckless, and his circle of friends was getting more and more toxic. If you think that's crazy, then you'll be shocked when you hear that Ghislaine Maxwell introduced him to Jeffrey Epstein. Andrew only saw the luxury, the private jets, the glamorous homes, and the access to models and celebrities. What he didn't see, or chose not to see, was the price of that friendship. Epstein was already whispered about in elite circles, already known for behavior that should have warned any decent man to run away. But Andrew didn't run. He embraced it. He was blinded by greed and status. The people who had dealt with his temper, his arrogance, and his entitled attitude knew exactly why. He had always been this way. The public would later be horrified by the photograph of Andrew with his arm around Virginia Giuffre's waist. She was a minor, with Maxwell smiling in the background. To the world, it was shocking. To the palace staff, it was confirmation. The man they served, the man who screamed about curtains and stuffed animals, who demanded obedience, who paraded through life without shame, was now exposed in the ugliest way possible. This was just the preview. Now you'll know the details, painful, disgusting details. Hope you're ready for it. By the time the 1990s ended, Andrew's reputation had gotten so bad that even palace insiders began questioning his future. His divorce from Sarah Ferguson in 1996 should have been a fresh start. But instead, it opened a new chapter of embarrassment. Just months later, photographs of Ferguson having her toes sucked by her financial advisor were splashed across tabloids. The scandal hurt both of them, but Andrew's refusal to distance himself from her confused the public. He lived with her on and off for years after their divorce, making people suspicious that the pair were tied together financially in ways they never fully explained. Andrew threw himself deeper into the lifestyle that earned him the title Randy Andy. His relationships with actresses, models, and socialites were documented almost every week, but his behavior seemed increasingly desperate. At one point, he was rumored to have dated Caprice Barrett, a relationship that ended under ridicule. The once handsome prince was aging badly in the public eye, mocked as a middle-aged man clinging to the playboy image of his youth. When the Queen appointed him as Britain's special representative for international trade and investment in 2001, many hoped it would give him dignity. Instead, it gave him a free pass. In theory, he was supposed to open doors for British companies overseas. In practice, he turned the role into his personal empire. He flew on private jets, stayed in luxury hotels, and surrounded himself with controversial businessmen. Reports came out about him becoming friends with Muammar Gaddafi's son, Saif, and other dictatorial figures. Raising questions about why a senior royal was getting cozy with dictators leaked American government, cables in 2010 confirmed what officials had been saying for years. U.S. diplomats described Andrew as cocky and rude, a man who almost crossed the line into rudeness when discussing anti-corruption measures. At one lunch in Kyrgyzstan, he stunned us and British officials by ranting about journalists and lecturing them on how governments should ignore public opinion. Instead of representing British values, Andrew embarrassed them with his arrogance. But his worst flaw wasn't arrogance. It was his inability to resist flattery. Businessmen quickly realized that a few compliments could win them access to a British prince. Andrew built friendships with Kazakh oligarchs, selling his home, Sunninghill Park, to one for £15 million, which was £3 million above its asking price. The house sat empty and rotting afterward, confirming suspicions that the sale was a shady favor. Rather than a legitimate deal, questions about money followed him constantly. Where was he getting his wealth? And who was funding his lavish lifestyle? It was in this situation that Ghislaine Maxwell stepped in, introducing him to Jeffrey Epstein. To Andrew, Epstein was perfect, wealthy, connected, and able to provide the glamorous lifestyle Andrew craved. Epstein offered what Andrew had been losing for years. Relevance. The prince, who was fading into ridicule, suddenly had access to New York power circles, with models, celebrities, and billionaires. He didn't ask questions about Epstein's past. Or maybe he didn't care. What mattered was that Epstein treated him like royalty. Even when Britain no longer did, Andrew's visits to Epstein's properties became a regular thing. Flight logs later showed him flying on Epstein's private jet. Witnesses remembered seeing him at Epstein's mansion in New York. Photographs showed him walking with Epstein in Central Park. Even after Epstein had served prison time for sex crimes, the world was stunned that a senior royal would hang out with a convicted sex offender. For Andrew, it was business as usual. He dismissed Epstein's crimes as inconvenient rumors, believing that his own name could survive any scandal. But then came the photograph. In 2001, a 17-year-old girl named Virginia Giuffre claimed she had been trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell and forced into sexual encounters with powerful men. One of those men, she said, was Prince Andrew. The photograph showed him smiling in a London townhouse, his arm draped around her bare waist, Maxwell grinning in the background. To Andrew, it was a small, forgettable moment. To the world, it was damning evidence. Andrew denied everything. He insisted he had no memory of meeting her, even as the photograph proved otherwise. He claimed he had never been upstairs in Maxwell's townhouse. He said he had no reason to associate with Giuffre, but his excuses sounded fake, and each denial made people more suspicious that he was lying. The palace scrambled to contain the story, but it only got worse. Journalists uncovered more details of Andrew's friendship with Epstein, including the fact that Andrew stayed at Epstein's New York mansion after Epstein's conviction. To most people, it was unthinkable that a royal would set foot in the home of a man convicted of trafficking minors. To Andrew, it was nothing more than a convenient place to stay. As more women came forward against Epstein, Andrew's name kept appearing in court filings and news reports. The palace tried to separate him from the scandal, but it was too late. The man once mocked as a spoiled, irrelevant playboy was now linked to one of the darkest criminal networks of modern times. His behavior, once dismissed as arrogance or weirdness, was suddenly seen as dangerous. The stories of bullying servants, screaming over curtains, and demanding teddy bears no longer sounded childish. They sounded like the traits of a man who had never been told no, never faced consequences, and never learned boundaries. For years, Britain had put up with Andrew's excesses, his spending, his womanizing, his arrogance, but Epstein turned him into a liability the monarchy could not ignore. He had crossed a line that could not be hidden behind palace walls. And now he had started his true downfall. Prince Andrew's life, after 2019, no longer looked like that of a senior royal. The so-called honorable prince, who once moved freely in military uniform and walked at the Queen's side, was suddenly a man without a job. His royal patronages were cut, military associations were taken away, and his calendar was wiped clean. But the damage was far deeper than just losing appearances. Andrew was being quietly erased from the monarchy itself, while his scandals continued to grow louder. What made his scandals more evil wasn't just the intimate photograph with a minor. It was the patterns of power that protected him for so long. American investigators revealed Epstein's network included politicians, CEOs, lawyers, and royalty. Many faced questions, but Andrew's position as the Queen's son protected him for decades. The effilation wasn't just that he had ties to Epstein. It was that Britain's monarchy had shielded him from accountability. Reports in 2020 showed that the palace had pressured news networks to keep stories buried for years. One ABC anchor was caught on a hot mic admitting she had the story 3 years ago, but was stopped because it involved powerful figures. Andrew benefited from the silence that ordinary men, accused of the same things, would never have enjoyed. Not only that, there was the disastrous interview that later ruined everything he ever held dear. In 2019, he made a fool out of himself in a public spectacle in what became known as the awful interview. Virginia's accusations forced Andrew into an extraordinary defense fight. Andrew claimed he had been somewhere else at a pizza. Express in Woking on the night a girl says Jeffrey Epstein trafficked her for sex with him. He mentioned memories of fathers and daughters to gain sympathy. But the detail that exploded everywhere was his claim that he didn't sweat during that dance because he had a strange medical condition. Something about excess adrenaline in the Falklands War, he said, that somehow shut off his sweat glands. His inability to sweat had become a shield, a bizarre, self-mocking defense. He became known as a man whose most memorable public confession wasn't a cry of guilt, but a refusal. I don't sweat. When accusations piled up, he didn't stay quiet. That same child who angered the guards who kicked horses, who thought pain from staff was a joke. The one who thought the world was his playground, he now finally knew the true meaning of consequences. Shortly after that, he was thrown out by the royal palace as they forced him to announce the news. Prince Andrew announced on November 20, 2019, that he would step back from public duties for the foreseeable future following his disastrous BBC Newsnight interview with Emily Maitlis for Days. Earlier in the interview that aired on November 16, 2019, he attempted to defend his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, but instead drew widespread condemnation. His denial of ever meeting Virginia Giuffre, his claim that he could not sweat, and his insistence that staying at Epstein's house was the honorable thing to do, triggered intense public outrage. Businesses, universities, and charities quickly began cutting ties with him. The backlash was so severe that Andrew issued a statement saying his association with Epstein had become a major disruption to the royal families. The Queen approved his withdrawal from duties, marking the first time a senior royal had been forced into semi-retirement purely because of a public scandal. But that's not all. Even after Epstein died in 2019 and Ghislaine Maxwell's arrest in 2020, Andrew avoided setting foot in the United States. His lawyers fought against attempts to drag him into court. He repeatedly dodged being served papers until Virginia finally sued him in a New York court in 2021. That case was catastrophic for Andrew. The Queen had to finance part of his settlement, reported to be as high as £12 million, paid not as an admission of guilt, but to avoid a public trial. Still, the world understood what had just happened. A prince had written a check to silence accusations of sex abuse. But if the settlement buried the legal fight, it didn't bury the disgrace. The timing could not have been worse. Britain was in economic decline. The monarchy was reeling from Prince Harry and Meghan's exit. And then came Prince Philip's death in 2021 at his father's funeral. Andrew walked behind the coffin, but was told to stay out of the public spotlight. Cameras still caught him. His disgraced image, walking silently beside his siblings, was the opposite of the man he once was, a proud naval officer, a Falklands veteran, the Queen's favorite, by 2022. When Queen Elizabeth died, Andrew's presence at royal ceremonies was carefully managed. He was banned from wearing his military uniform during her funeral procession, allowed only a brief exception at the lying in state. Crowds booed when he appeared. Hecklers shouted, "You're a sick old man," and Scottish police arrested a protester for disturbing him. For the first time in centuries, a British prince could not even appear in public without facing open hostility. But behind palace walls, another battle was happening. Charles, now king, quietly made it clear that Andrew would never return to frontline royal duties. Sources close to the monarchy leaked that Andrew begged for reinstatement, insisting he still had a role to play. But the answer was firm. There was no role left. Reports claimed Andrew even considered legal routes to force his way back into public duties. His desperation revealed what he feared most, that without the palace, he was simply a disgraced man, stripped of identity, and by 2024, he was finished with this new accusation. A Chinese businessman known in court papers as H6, later identified as Yang, was banned from the UK in March 2023 by Home Secretary Sue Braverman on national security grounds. Judges in the Special Immigration Appeals Commission found that H6 had gained an unusual degree of trust with Prince Andrew. Documents showed that H6 was authorized by Andrew's advisor, Dominic Hampshire, to act on his behalf for talks with potential investors in China. A letter from Hampshire to H6 said, "Outside of the prince's closest internal confidants, you sit at the very top of a tree that many people would like to be on." Authorities believe H6 is linked to the United Front Work Department, a part of the Chinese Communist Party used in influence operations. On H6's devices were documents indicating links to CCP officials and attempts to leverage his relationship with Prince Andrew for political or business advantage. Prince Andrew's office has stated that he stopped all contact with H6 once concerns were raised and that he only met him through official channels and never discussed anything of a sensitive nature.